Hello, good morning and good afternoon, and welcome to this webinar. My name is Deirdre Fulton and I'm a partner at Midas Aviation. I'll be moderating today's discussion, and this is the latest in OAG's series of webinars about the impact of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Welcome back to those of you who've joined us before, and you'll be familiar, if you have, with the format where we run through some slides and then we pose your questions to our panel. Talking of our panel, I'm joined today by John Grant, OEG's senior analyst, who's been tracking the impacts since the very start of the coronavirus outbreak. And we also have Mark Clarkson with us today, OEG's EVP of Product Management. So welcome to both of you. So today, as we've done before with these webinars, we're going to use OEG's data to provide an overview of what's happening in terms of air capacity and frequency globally at a regional level, and then we'll take a deeper look at some country markets to try and understand to what extent there might be, and I stress the word might, a shift from crisis towards the start of recovery. We'll take a look at cancellations as well as part of that, and then we're also going to take a look at the impact on capacity of what might be a shift in airline planning horizons. And finally, we've got some travel search insights to share with you. As I said, we then hope to be able to answer some of your questions, so please send those in to us using the question box throughout the webinar. Everyone who's registered will receive a recording later today, so don't worry about missing anything. And we'll also be sending you a short survey at the end of the webinar today, so we'd really appreciate it if you could just take a few moments to answer some questions about your views on travel in the coming months. Let's jump in then. So the first slide, which I gave you a very slight sneak preview of a moment ago, we've been showing this for a number of weeks now, and this really is the progression. But it's interesting, John, isn't it, that between 2 weeks ago and now, we're not seeing a really significant shift, are we, at a global level, certainly?
No, we're not. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. We seem to be becalmed in terms of capacity changes and any significant movements in capacity, certainly at the top level. If we see a market adding back capacity in one part of the world, then it frequently gets netted down by another part of the world seeing a similar level of capacity being dropped. So we're hovering around this 68% mark. And I think as we'll show later, a lot of the work we've done and a lot of the analysis we've been showing is around this week and previous weeks rather than looking forward because of the uncertainty in those schedules and capacity. But there are many airlines that are certainly waiting for next Monday, the 1st of June. And beyond that, the 15th of June is a key date, particularly in Europe, where we have some lockdowns lifting and some airlines already planning for expanded services. So we're in a holding pattern at the moment, I think, whilst we just wait for that to sort of all begin to clear. Before we do move on to the next slide, though, perhaps if there is anyone listening who happens to be in New Zealand, could they drop us a question, please? Because Deirdre and I have some analysis about New Zealand in this presentation, and we were just hoping or wondering if anyone so far away from us here in Luton is going to be on the webinar today.
Thank you for that, John. I'm wondering how many different types of transport analogy you might manage to get in this morning. We've had becalmed and holding pattern already, so
absolutely.
Let's see.
They're all stacking up, Deirdre.
They are. Okay, so let's take a look then at the regional picture. So we've toned down the yellow a little bit. There might still be it might still be a bit much of a contrast here, but essentially what we're showing is the table of month for January, February and March versus the previous year, and April. And then for me, this is capacity. Sorry, no, it's flights
Flights.
versus the same week last year,
Yeah,
and that really it illustrates just what you were saying, doesn't it? So
it does. So I
there's
mean,
there's a step back
we're
in
at,
Asia.
yeah, yeah, we are. We're at that sort of 68%, two-thirds of
Mm.
capacity still missing
Hmm.
from this time last year. And Asia, um, that's quite interesting, and just highlights how frustrating it must be to be an airline network planner at the moment,
Yeah,
where
yeah.
essentially that recovery that we're seeing occur there is driven by Indian domestic
Hmm.
capacity having been added back in.
And that
And
was in
then
anticipation, wasn't it, of quarantine
absolutely,
and lockdown
yeah,
changing?
yep. And then just as domestic services were about to be relaunched, there was an announcement that the lockdown would continue for a further period. So the airlines took their capacity back out and started adjusting again. And of course, many of you will have seen that Indian domestic services reopened yesterday. Approximately, I think it was 40,000 people were carried, according to the Indian government. Large queues at airports, many cancellations, many of the things that we expect to see at other airports and in other markets as we rebuild, high levels of cancellation. But
Yeah.
even so, it's the signs of a recovery are there,
Hmm.
and we've got to be optimistic that we're going to see some bounce back in the next couple of weeks as well, I think.
Yeah, and that there's a little sign here, isn't there? To just start our
Yeah, absolutely.
New Zealand
To our
story.
yes, to our friends in
The,
New Zealand, 34,000, I think it's 34,500 additional seats this week, all of them domestic. So, within that concept of the travel bubble, um,
yeah,
at least the constrained Tasman travel bubble, most of them being operated by small regional aircraft as well. So yeah, there are signs, there are little spots where there's not hot growth, but there is growth occurring.
slow and steady wins the race, maybe in this case, doesn't it? And we'll come back to this idea of bubbles later on this in the webinar, won't we? To just
Yeah.
um, try and explore that a little bit in a little bit more detail. Okay, so let's go into the country level picture, and that's the New Zealand point there, isn't it? So nine
Yes.
percentage point shift in the right direction, which we're
Hmm.
certainly not seeing other than at some points in China, which is at the opposite end of the scale, isn't it, in terms of market size?
It is,
Um,
and China, we know that nearly all of that, virtually 95% of the recovery we've seen there has been in the domestic market.
mhm.
Further seats were added back this week on Chinese domestic services. Interestingly, around 25% of those new flights or those new seats were by virtue of putting wide-bodied capacity back into the market. So we're seeing
Ah, okay.
more A330, Boeing 777 services, which could be an indicator that there are particular flights where demand has picked up and load factors are recovering and getting to normal sort of pre-COVID-19 levels. Or it could be that they're being used as a means of socially maintaining social distancing on aircraft, as
Yeah,
there is a
yeah,
bit of a pickup in demand. But even in Hong Kong, there are positive signs with moves towards allowing connecting transfer traffic to take place again, which would obviously help a network carrier like Cathay Pacific rebuild out from their current situation.
I think like so many aspects of recovery, we need somebody to take those first steps, don't we? In terms of to establish international connectivity again,
Mhm.
to start the process of processing passengers and making the whatever needs to be put in place from a health screening perspective and actually making that work operationally. And then it's almost as if that, the sort of analogy, I guess we were talking earlier, weren't we, about schools potentially returning and
Mm.
you gain confidence by seeing other countries
Absolutely.
having go through that process.
Yeah, there's the whole momentum factor, isn't there? And I
Mm.
think it's interesting, although yet still to be approved for commercial operation. Both United and Delta have indicated a desire to reopen their Chinese networks in the next few weeks, which, for a country such as the United States and US carriers to want to do that, I think is a bold indication of both
Yeah,
a belief that there is demand, and also trust in the health processes and screening
yeah,
processes that will be in place
yeah.
in China. So I think
I mean, it's, putting the politics aside, there's an economic need, isn't there, for trade to start again, and that's not just cargo. It's all the associated activity that supports that trade, buyers, managing relationships that drives the need for travel.
absolutely, and I think we're going to talk about it in a couple of weeks' time on a webinar. But one of the things about the Chinese market, of course, is that it is 90% domestic travel. There is still less than
Yeah,
100,000 weekly seats, international seats from China to any destination outside of the country. And the level of connectivity between domestic and international flights in China has traditionally been quite low as well.
yeah,
So, they do not need international traffic to support a domestic network, whereas perhaps
mm,
somewhere like Vietnam has a higher requirement for that sort of traffic.
yeah. Okay. Talking of Vietnam then, so this is the same data, but shown weekly. Um, Vietnam is really standing out, isn't it, in terms of obviously much smaller scale, um, but growth frequency looks like it's going in the right direction, doesn't it? This is
Yeah,
domestic,
it's
isn't it?
interesting. There's a lot of interest in Vietnam at the moment from
Mm,
the perspective of looking and seeing how the market responds, and in some instances, probably more focus on Vietnam than there has been on China in the last couple of weeks.
mm-hmm,
But their domestic capacity is now back at just over 700,000 seats a week, which is staggering. Um, in January, it was just over 1 million seats. And just to
mm.
think Vietnam has a market of 1 million domestic seats a week is alone is
Yeah.
quite impressive. But to have got back to 70%, and that's with minimal international connectivity still, I think is a reflection of the strength of that market, and also the interest in it. And as we'll see later in terms of search activity and interest, there is something going on there. There is
Yeah,
an
yeah.
interest in travel for sure.
And that piece about international to domestic connectivity is the missing bit, isn't it? That we've talked lots about, and the industry is talking about domestic recovery comes first, and we're certainly seeing some signs of that
Yeah.
across some of these markets. But that piece around domestic to international is the kind of missing part, isn't it?
It is, and that's why for some markets such as the United States that has both domestic and international traffic, and indeed Turkey that has a strong mix of domestic and international, you'd expect to see that domestic recovery occurring before the international, but they're balanced to take advantage of both. Whereas we've said it before, the Middle East, the big three Middle East airlines, entirely dependent on international to international connectivity.
Yeah,
And to the point that Michelle's made here about travel bubbles, clearly a factor for those airlines is how do you break into a bubble at either end, um, if you're a hub airport with purely international traffic.
yeah, yeah. Okay. Let's take a look now then at which carriers are behind some of the growth in Asia Pacific this week. Obviously, we've talked about New Zealand. Um, half of the 10 who are adding most capacity right now are Chinese carriers, aren't they? As you'd expect.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think we do have anyone from New Zealand listening, by the way. Um, but it's
Wow.
interesting, isn't it? The Chinese carriers continue to slowly and cautiously add back capacity. And of course, to the point I was making earlier, they've reached a point where it's not perhaps as much about frequency additions, but purely capacity additions, and therefore deploying wide-bodied aircraft again that previously were sitting on the ground. That's certainly the case in for Air China and China Southern, who have, as I say, been actively upgrading aircraft types in the last couple of weeks, and it's good
Yeah.
to see Hainan Airlines putting some more capacity back into the market, given the difficulties the HNA
Mm.
group has had in the last couple of months. But we continue to look to China for where much of the growth has occurred from.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because clearly there's a sort of cautious but steady recovery in the domestic market in China. And that in itself, to sort of pick up on what we were saying earlier, I guess, helps. The more that continues, that helps consumer confidence. And as people see, domestic travel resuming, and it starts to become the norm again. And you can see that then will give people the confidence to travel, perhaps short haul internationally initially, and then eventually longer haul. But I wonder to what extent that demand will be frustrated by the rest of the world, not being on the same page in terms of being just, we've talked all along, haven't we, about
A different
and
pace
we
of
saw that,
recovery.
yeah, the
Yeah.
pace, exactly. And it's topical for us here in the UK that we're still in lockdown. So the idea that we could even travel to an airport right now is beyond our reach, isn't it? So I
Yeah.
think there's going to be a lag, isn't there, at some point that the industry is going to have to work really hard to lobby government to address.
No two countries, Deirdre, will come out of this and follow the same path to recovery. And that sort of plays through to the point of, will we see a recovery? The answer is yes, of course we will, and we're beginning to, but it will
Mm,
not be an overnight sensation. It will be almost a subtle process of recovery until, if you looked at the market now and you did no analysis and you came back in 6 weeks time, you'd suddenly say, wow, well, this has now opened and this has opened and this market's now connected back to this one,
yeah,
etc.
yeah.
So it's going to be through a process of drip rather than a floodgate of capacity and markets reopening. But
Mm,
South America apparently is now the center of the pandemic, so we can see the shift globally as it moves around the world, and that will be the same in the recovery.
yeah,
And
yeah.
even within each country market, there will be sectors and airlines and airline types that will recover faster than others because they have
We've
either
seen that
a more
already, haven't
effective,
we? Yeah.
exactly, they have a more effective marketing strategy. They're very aggressive on price and they can stimulate market. So you can't take what you see in China or Vietnam and apply that to Germany or to the United Kingdom, for
Mm.
instance.
Yeah, it's going to look different, isn't it? The pattern of
Yes.
recovery is
Yeah,
is going to look
definitely.
different, even within a part of the world. Even within a region. Um, okay. So next, we mentioned, and regularly we've been looking at, as flights come back in, what has happened to cancellations. And we've seen certainly in some markets around the world very high cancellation rates as carriers just try and work out what the optimum level of capacity and frequency is right now. Um, I think what's encouraging when we look at some of this data is that we saw when we reported 2 weeks ago on this, China's cancellation rate was running between 12 and 13%. So that's coming down to 9%, although still way above the industry norm of around 1% of cancellations. but we're seeing in some of these other markets that are adding capacity and frequency back in, that cancellation rates are quite low, aren't they? So Vietnam hasn't had a big spike of cancellations that we've perhaps seen elsewhere. We had to mention New Zealand, didn't we? Because their sort of cautious return. It's encouraging to see again that that's not feeding through to the needs to cancel. And South Korea, again, interesting. It's maintained certainly for the last couple of weeks an almost normal return to cancellation rate.
Yeah. It's one of the things about New Zealand, of course, is that a lot of the capacity that has been put back in is both domestic and is on smaller aircraft types. So typically, it's Dash 8 type services, which generally, obviously have a lot less capacity than an A320 or a 319, and because they are domestic, and because there has been this pent-up demand, my suspicion is that there is enough confidence amongst travellers and enough historic built-up demand, that they're able to sustain that operation, and probably are supporting some quite good load factors at the moment.
Yeah. Okay.
I
was going to ask you, Mark, any info?
Well, just for those people that have been on the webinars regularly, obviously this is a fairly regular slide we put up, and I'm always intrigued by the sort of level of cancellation rate in China and the recovery, if you like, inverted commas. And your point, it is going down, but it's not going down very fast. It's kind of sustained. No. And I'm just wondering if there's a bit more to it in terms of a lot of the additional domestic capacity is probably, if you like, connecting the hubs. Not necessarily the hubs, but certainly the big centres, if you like, the big metropolitan areas. And I'm wondering if that gives rise to a sort of higher level of cancellation, because there's just so much frequency in some cases being put back in those markets, and therefore you can reduce the frequency, but you're still keeping the market open. Whereas maybe for some other domestic markets, that spread is a little bit more disparate, and therefore helping them get back to a lower level of cancellation. It's just an observation, and I'm now keen to go and look at the data and see if that's the case. But it just kind of hit me in the face there, thinking that is there maybe something behind that that's maintaining that level of cancellation rate for China.
Yeah. Well, we'll hold that thought and ask you to come back to that. Not this morning. Not this morning. No. But maybe the next time. Okay, let's move on to our next slide. So we mentioned at the outset that it feels like we've been in this period of crisis where we've talked about very short-term planning horizons, day by day. If you remember those heady weeks where in some cases things moved hour by hour during the day, and your team, Mark, were heavily engaged in just trying to keep track of all of the restrictions and all of the changes. I think what's really interesting is we, as part of a look at, we've got some slides that go further out past the 6 weeks here coming. But what we thought would be interesting to do would be to take a look at capacity split by domestic and international globally, which is what you see here. We've got last year weekly capacity in the blue line, and then what was filed last week for the 6 weeks ahead, and then what was filed this week for the 6 weeks ahead. And you can sort of see that there's still a degree of volatility, can't you? In terms of domestically, what we're seeing is 25 million seats is the gap there over the 6 weeks that have come out in a week, and internationally it's a bigger figure, so 37.5 million seats have come out. And I think that's just really there are lots of different things going on in there, and we probably could spend far longer than we have time trying to unpick all of that. But some interesting snapshots, aren't they? Just in terms of there's still, yes, we've got cautious recovery in some
Yeah,
markets,
so
but we've still got change.
absolutely. And, the slides we've shown up to this point today have been about the past and how the COVID-19 has impacted the industry, and a few little snippets about where the recovery is. But of course, it's the forward-looking capacity and the forward-looking demand sentiment that is of much more interest now, that we've reached what appears to be the bottom. And airlines' planning horizons look like they've begun to extend out to more than just what's going to happen next week, and airlines are beginning to look forward 4 to 6 weeks, and in some cases a little bit further. And that inevitably means that the capacity they had in previously is now being adjusted and shaved. I think these two slides clearly reinforce the point we've made on many occasions, that the international recovery is much more vulnerable,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
the domestic is pretty solid, in terms of capacity at least. And I think we will see more activity in capacity cuts probably in the next fortnight, as well as airlines begin to look forward into the early part of July. And July in itself will be, the first week of July will be another watershed moment for European capacity. It's the beginning of the real holiday peak
The
season.
summer, yeah.
So, airlines will be gearing themselves up for that. But that 6-week planning horizon is just so important for the airlines in terms of resourcing, bringing staff back off furlough, reigniting the engines of their businesses, putting distribution back on sale, and importantly, consumer confidence and consumer booking patterns. Airlines who put 400,000 seats back in next week and expect to fill 300,000 of them are completely missing the point. It's not going to happen. People need to plan holidays themselves and be confident that they can book and they won't get quarantined in some country.
And I think that's where we are right now, particularly in Europe, aren't we? And to some extent in other parts of the world, that there is a growing appetite to travel, if people can be reassured that it's safe.
Yeah,
But
and
airlines are responding to that, and there's capacity being put into the market, and we'll see that in a couple of slides' time about where we are by July and August. But there's still lockdown in some cases. There's still restrictions, and it sort of feels like the point at which maybe some of the lockdown will be eased to the point that people will be freer to travel is almost a little bit too late in terms of the peak, the
and
peak summer travel.
we're seeing that already. So we track
Yeah.
the US TSA numbers, and this week, on the 25th of this week, there was something like I think it's 350,000 people processed, which is double the number that were processed on the 1st of May. So, there's more people traveling there. It's still only 13% of what usually flies.
Yeah.
But, there is some momentum there. Air Baltic, small, fabulous little airline, they, within the Baltic bubble that has been created, reported thousands of bookings as soon as they put flights back on sale, and they had a reasonable first week of operation with some quite encouraging load factors being reported on services to Frankfurt and Oslo. So we just need to give it time. It's going to take a bit of time for this to recover. We can't expect an overnight return. We fell off a cliff as an industry, and now we're trying to scramble our way back out.
And I guess the reality, though, is that for many airlines and indeed airports, we need the recovery to be quick, don't we? And that's the tension, isn't it? That's the challenge.
Completely. Cash reserves have been drained. I see Ryanair have unexpectedly slapped the German government with a litigation regarding 9 billion euros of state aid for Lufthansa this morning. So, you know, airlines need this cash and they need it to survive.
Yeah.
But the recovery is going to take a bit of time.
Okay. Let's dive down a little bit into this, because you know, this is it's a big change, isn't it? And we were curious about, so who's driving that, and where's that change happening? We took a look at Asia. So this is Asia capacity, all international capacity. And so of that 37.5 million, 8.5 million of it has come out in Asia.
Mm-hmm.
And then we drilled down a little bit more into, are there any countries where there's a particularly different or counter trend thing happening? And it's interesting. So that 8.5 million, about 80% of that is accounted for in these 10 countries. But there's interesting things going on, aren't there?
There are. So in the case of China, we continue to see the restrictions on the number of international flights that are permitted, and the criteria of can't sell more than 75% of available seats, etc., etc. And that accounts essentially for that capacity cut you see there. And you know, there has been discussion about that policy could extend throughout the summer, as the Chinese government fears an inbound COVID-19 wave from returning nationals and from business and leisure visitors. Similarly, in India, you know, international lockdowns are still in place. Singapore, I think that's just an acceptance that the circuit breaker, whilst being eased in the last few days, still has an influence. Although, interestingly, Changi has announced that it will allow more international to international connecting passengers. Well, everyone's an international passenger in Singapore. But it just goes to show that this slide probably shows as much as any other slide that each country is going to come out of it in its own way and at its own pace, and you just have to live with that.
And Mark, you have the job of keeping track of all of that, don't you, or overseeing the keeping track of all of that? Oh, we seem to have lost Mark for a moment. Okay, so we'll move on to. I mentioned at the start of this piece that.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can now. Yeah.
Sorry.
The mute button.
I was talking. What went wrong? Apologies.
We were listening, Mark. We were listening.
Of course you were. No, I was just gonna. I mean, obviously, all the countries are down there a reasonable amount. I'm just wondering if it's more a reflection on the kind of, we've talked about the credibility gap, or the view of those schedules getting pushed out, and is it just more of a view on the international capacity being we'll push that bit out, we'll push that bit further, we're focusing a bit more on the core domestic market in most cases, and we'll just continually push those out. I mean, to John's point, I think there's obviously individual reasons for each country, but I think more generally it just reflects that we'll get to it when we need to kind of approach. And as we've seen that in the carriers updating their schedules and changing their schedules, it feels that is somewhat more inferred for the international capacity over the domestic.
Yeah, and it's, you know, when you look at it, Singapore clearly has always had a reliance on Australian and Southwest Pacific traffic, and if there is an international bubble and little international traffic out from that market at the moment, that impacts not just that part of Singapore Airlines network, but the whole of their network. And similarly, in Thailand, a completely different scenario where Thai International, you know, are in a financial crisis and capacity is being cut, and other factors are at play there. So it's different everywhere.
I should note, someone's just asked as a question about where is Hong Kong in this. It's actually number 11, so it's not included in the China figures. It just didn't make the cut.
It was minus
in terms,
13%, wasn't it?
it
Compared
was,
to,
yeah. So actually interesting. Slightly less there, but I guess wider
yeah,
issues
and
in Hong Kong.
it's certainly not included in the Chinese statistics, just
No,
to
no.
make sure of the politics.
So I guess to come back to the point you were saying there about credibility, and we need to be cautious about the context that we use that word in. It's more about how credible is it that by summer, essentially, so August, that so the yellow line here is schedules filed. Both yellow lines are schedules filed for the week by week capacity for this year. Blue is last year, and grey we'll come back to in a minute. It, how likely is it, and to build on what we've just been saying, that we would see domestic capacity really return to last year's levels? I think this it more than anything probably reflects that planning horizon, doesn't it? That we haven't really got into that yet. I think
No,
there's
we haven't, and there's no, from an airline perspective, that there isn't such urgency in the domestic market to do that.
yeah,
It's you can have a shorter planning horizon,
yeah,
particularly at this moment in time when most people are booking less than 2 weeks before travel.
yeah.
Same
And so
can't be said for the other one, though.
well, no. So the grey line, I said I'd come back to that. I don't want to forget to do that. What we thought would be just interesting, and this is not by any means a prediction or a forecast, it's just a simple, if capacity was to return to, say, 65% of last year's levels by the end of this year, what would need to happen each week to get to that point? And it sort of feels instinctively like maybe that's, I don't want to say pessimistic, but it might be better than that. There might be a better picture than that. But on international, it's a different story, isn't it? Actually, the requirement is far bigger to even get to that point, and
It
that
is,
doesn't
and
seem particularly credible, does it?
no, it doesn't. And I mean, if you look at where we are now, and you look forward to about the 15th of June, when we get up to around 30,000 international, 30 million international seats, I wouldn't be surprised if through the whole of this year we don't get above that 40. We don't
Sounds
get much
dangerously
above
like a
that.
prediction, John.
Well, I know it's just when you think about the planning horizons we're at now. It's just going to be tough to see that we're going to see a lot of change. And in some markets, even when we get past this point of lockdowns and quarantines, are people going to have enough confidence to want to travel those vast distances, or from one continent to another?
Yeah, with all the associated uncertainties around that. And it's back to that point we made earlier, isn't it, about people gaining confidence by seeing evidence of it happening somewhere else, and being reassured that, well, if it works in that market, and airlines are adopting a consistent approach to health checking and screening, then confidence will slowly start to
And we
come
are
back.
seeing that. And ICAO are publishing their guidelines by the end of this week, and EASA announced and published their guidelines on health and screening protocols for airports and airlines as well. So we're beginning to see some documentation that's going to allow for standardizations of processes, but that standardization is not going to be possible at every airport. Some of it could, if you're a small little UK or European regional airport, you're not going to be able to put in place the same measures as a Heathrow or an Amsterdam Schiphol. But I the other thing about this international capacity, and partly to answer one of the questions around international lockdowns, everyone's looking at every international market is looking at each others international markets to ease the lockdown so they can begin to travel as well. So you need that reciprocity on both ends before we're going to really see any breakthrough in international capacity being added back.
Yeah, yeah, and let's not forget, we were talking just a few weeks ago about the capacity of governments to deal with all of that, with everything else that's happening, and there are some governments, there are some countries that absolutely have been on the page from day one of recognising the contribution and the importance of international aviation. There are others that's it's not top of the list of priorities.
No, absolutely not. And if you're it's no surprise Willie Walsh at IAG doesn't have much hair, or Michael O'Leary at Ryanair, because if a large part of your business is in the United Kingdom and one week you're being told one thing and then France is included in a bubble and then it's not, and now we're talking about corridors of uncertainty. It's really frustrating for an airline to try, and it almost frustrates the attempts to reignite the economies and to get the world moving again. And on what we see here at the moment, we will inevitably see through the summer higher than normal rates of cancellation because airlines are testing the market to see what will happen. And to a question asked by Mike, there is no doubt that we will see chopping and changing of frequency and capacity.
Yeah, okay. Picking up on the bubble point, let's have a look at this. So it's sort of, I guess there's, the media has moved on to the next story, haven't they? But a couple of weeks ago, there was a lot of talk, as really driven, I think, by the Trans-Tasman relaxing of lockdown requirements there. There began to emerge this talk about the bubble, didn't there? So Trans-Tasman bubble, that in theory you've got two countries where, the peak has passed, the peak of the crisis has passed, hopefully. Cases were low, and there's sort of mutual agreement and confidence in each other's processes to facilitate travel again. And that sort of snowballed a little bit, didn't it? In terms of, okay, well, what other bubbles?
Yeah. So we've looked at some other bubbles.
We have. Yeah.
So you can see here, South America we've added, and Sub-Saharan Africa, because people always ask us what's happening in Africa. We've got no one in New Zealand at the moment. We probably don't have anyone in Africa listening at the moment either. But interestingly, Deirdre, if you add up all of those percentages in terms of bubbles, then in terms of the global capacity, it still just hovers at around 50% of the global capacity, and illustrates, I think, really strongly the importance of, could we create corridors between particular bubbles, or the fact that bubbles really are only a short-term solution to the bigger challenge of travel without COVID-19. So it's something that is an interesting concept, but those bubbles have to burst if we're going to get back to anything like a normal aviation world.
And to some extent, do they take us down a path of more a more restrictive environment than we might want to be in? In terms of that we'll have a bubble between two particular countries, but no one else is invited.
Exactly. Bilaterals and medicals is a phrase that springs to mind, and it does begin to restrict the demand and the recovery that will take place. And interestingly, when you just look at those bubbles, if those become the bubbles in which we live and in which air travel is contained, there is absolutely no need for any wide-bodied aircraft to operate anywhere in the world.
Yeah, it's a good point.
Though those are all A320 type ranges quite comfortably, or 737 for those who are operating that aircraft.
there's another interesting piece of analysis that we might come back to at some point. Okay, let's move on to our sort of final segment. We've got something a little bit different now to talk through. We, because of the time difference, we aren't joined by somebody from 3Victors who are behind this Travel Recovery Insights portal. So we'll do our best to do it justice. But there is another webinar that we're running later today, which I think you potentially would be able to sign up to receive a recording of. And we would encourage you to do that, because there will be somebody from 3Victors joining us to talk in a bit more depth about this. But essentially, what 3Victors have done is they have compiled data from a range of different sources. So there's data about the level of cases, COVID cases. There's industry data about bookings, about search, about pricing. There's consumer and economic sentiment data that's been gathered by the Boston Consulting Group. And all of that has been pulled together into the Travel Recovery Insights portal. It's open source, so that means it's publicly available, and the link's here. And again, you'll get a copy of these slides, so you can go and explore it for yourself. But essentially, this is another window into what might be happening out there in terms of people's intent to travel, and then actually, you know, how that's materializing in reality.
And
Don,
as you said, yeah, as you
add?
said that, Deirdre, 300 people left this webinar to rapidly go and look at this website. So for the 5 of you that remain,
Yeah,
this
we'll
is
show you.
it is really a very valuable reference point with lots of data and content that supplements stuff that we're pulling out from the OAG databases. So as always, you know, data, you should look at more than one data source, but it does give you some very good insights, and we've got some of them here, haven't we?
Yeah, okay. So let's now, I'm conscious there's a lot on this slide, and some of it's very small. Really, this is just to give you a sort of snapshot of you know, of what the data looks like. So the most popular part of the recovery tracker is this. So these sort of 3 pillars that give insight on the trends in travel from each country, or I think you can also change that to look at regions and a collection of countries. The travel month, and then travel by direction and trip type, so essentially domestic and international.
And on the horizontal, Deirdre, we're showing the change in search activity over the last 14 days compared to the previous 14. And the vertical is comparing the change in the last 14 days against the average year on year.
Correct.
So in a wonderful world, we would be seeing everything that would be positive in terms of searches 14 days over the previous 14 days, and also year on year. But unfortunately, we're mired in negative territory with all of these countries.
And we'll come on to the next slide where we'll blow this up a little bit so we can. I know I'm struggling to see some of the text there. And this is another feature here that shows a sort of summary, doesn't it, of the picture, just I guess visually in a different way. And then I think if we were showing this in the live environment, there's more information, isn't there, that then
Absolutely. So
comes in.
if you hover on any one of these data points, then there's an explosion out into a more detailed piece of data that you can look at.
Okay, so let's just look a little bit more there. Now it's interesting, isn't it? We referenced Vietnam earlier, didn't we? So this is indicating that Vietnam, in particular, there's a greater, perhaps more than anywhere else, incidence of searches for travel to and from Vietnam right now. And this data, I think, was updated just yesterday, so it's pretty current, isn't it?
Last 14 days. And interestingly, both personally, because Italy has just crept to the positive side in terms of search activity compared to the previous 14 days, which is no coincidence given that it was one of the first European countries to actually ease both travel lockdowns and commercial restrictions. So even bars and gyms are open today. So I think it's interesting that as soon as there is some positive sentiment about a market, we begin to see a positive movement in terms of search activity. Clearly, compared to last year, we still have a huge journey to take. But we're beginning to move in the right direction, and you can see for which months there is more interest. So in this particular slide here, you can see that July 2020 is probably going to move in the next 14-day period into that positive space as well, where people will be looking. But a lot of people have given up on June. That plays to what we're seeing from the airlines as well in terms of capacity being added back.
It's interesting though, isn't it? Because I suppose instinctively, perhaps, I might have expected that, September and beyond would be further ahead, given that, and maybe this is a Western perspective, because essentially we've been told forget about this summer, think about the next holidays. So people are naturally thinking about people are thinking about October, they're thinking about next summer.
Is this maybe a good reflection of the market sentiment around the confidence to book that far out?
Absolutely.
And it's interesting, not wanting to cut the conversation on the middle visual, but when you look where round trip domestic is in the right hand side, and I think that probably ties it in quite nicely, right? It's it looks great because it's so far up, but for context, it's still 60 to 65% down year on year.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't included it because, quite frankly, you would be overwhelmed with the data. But there is also a whole portal around fares within this website and the work that Three Victors have been doing. And one of the interesting things there is, if you do begin to look out into June, July and August, we're not actually seeing any significant reductions in airfares that are in the market. And part of me thinks that's partly because airfares have always been very, very competitive. And many people have not yet begun to play with their revenue management tools and try and stimulate demand. Because lots of staff are still furloughed. So, that's not actively being undertaken by airlines at this moment in time.
Yeah, their ability to do that is lessened, isn't it? And nobody wants to. There's a real tension, isn't there, between lowering fares to stimulate travel, but equally keeping an eye on profitability and
it's a
your
horrible
cash
dilemma.
reserve.
Absolutely horrible dilemma. Do you need, if you want to be cash generative, but you do not want to be operating loss as well. So it's a real balancing act. Of course, the one thing we don't see in airfare data now, which is often ignored, but I think is increasingly important, is the contribution ancillary revenues are making to airlines today.
Yeah.
You know, for some carriers, it's actually of more value than the yield they receive.
Is it fair to say that, I mean, talk about confidence returning, and you know, there's been some comment and questions again around the middle seat, etc. But just thinking about the onboard ancillaries, certainly, I guess you've got to question how strong those will be even when confidence comes back. Will people just be choosing not to, you know, have that extra sandwich or extra beer in some cases, or literally just engage or buy anything because it's just another touch point, effectively?
Another point of contact.
I think that's something for the airline community to think about as well.
It is. There's a question from Anya that we can answer while this is on about does it consider cancellations? Well, the data comes from ARC for the ticketed part of this airline reporting. So yes, it does net out cancellations when you see this, I believe. But you can always, of course, contact Three Victors. Sure, they would be delighted to hear from you.
Okay, let's move on to our question session. I am conscious of time. We've got 5 minutes or so for questions. As I said earlier, if you have to duck out, then you will receive a recording of the webinar, so you won't miss anything if we run slightly over or on time.
Question from Ling Lam, I think, is quite interesting.
Yeah, that was my first question. I was coming to you
that's
on.
good. International recovery expectations. What do we think compared to ICAO's recovery forecast, which is a V or U? I found another letter in the alphabet, which is an L, which is probably more likely. This is not a V. It's way past being a V, unless you need to improve your handwriting. It's certainly not U-shaped. This is not going to come back overnight. It is a long, slow, painful recovery, particularly in the international market.
Yeah. Okay, let's see what else we've got. It's an interesting question. Is additional capacity in China reflective of a growth in demand or purely stimulated by government policies?
I think in China the two are always connected.
Yeah.
And you know what we're seeing here is part of that. It's just undoubtedly there is some stimulated demand from the government. You know, we've seen in the past or heard about cabbage fairs and all of these sort of phrases in recent weeks. But I think we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah.
Some questions about quarantining. When do you think quarantine in the UK will be released? Well, if you're a member of the UK government or an advisor to the UK government, Matthew, it's already been released apparently. The rest of us are just waiting.
Let's not rake over that issue again.
No, let's not get sore about what some can and some can't. But I think there is some interesting speculation around corridors, particularly within the European Union, and perhaps allowing air travel between those countries with a lower rate of R than perhaps the UK. So Italy springs to mind, Spain, Germany spring to mind, where we could perhaps have air corridors. But then that becomes very interesting because, you know, if we have an air corridor to Germany, suddenly Frankfurt appears as a potential hub, and with Lufthansa putting lots of capacity back from mid-June, is it a way for people to escape from the United Kingdom to travel anywhere to and from? So, you know, these are all the complexities that we have. I think there is an expectation.
That's the underestimated piece, isn't it? You know, in terms of, it's all very well talking about a travel bubble between country A and country B, but actually people are used to, you know, I mean, if you think about some of the unique routings that people take to get from A to B, that we've sort of come across, you know, in our years of experience in the industry,
and indeed travelled
people will,
ourselves. Yeah.
yeah, you know, people will find ways to travel, and so policing that and expecting that that won't happen, I think, is unrealistic. Gary makes a good point about the quarantine from the perspective of, you know, as countries impose quarantines, is that something that's really going to have a continued detrimental effect on confidence? You know, as maybe countries think that it's a good way in the short term to manage a staged return to international growth, but actually,
Well,
can
absolutely.
you?
I mean, the worst case scenario, and we know it will happen because of social media and because, you know, there's nothing like a bad news story for aviation is a picture of someone arriving at an airport, testing positive and being dragged away, surrounded by
Yeah.
police, health workers with masks on, etc., etc. You know, we can visualize that picture now.
Yeah.
So it is difficult, and it's the confidence is not just about the processes, but it's how much empathy is displayed when people with COVID-19 do present themselves at an airport, and either have to be, you know, quarantined or handled and processed in a particular way. It's extremely important, and I think we've got, as an industry, that's what ICAO and EASA are trying to do, is put those processes in place and be sympathetic with them as well.
Yeah.
There's a question here, you know, Adam's asked about a potential double dip or a bounce of a COVID-19/20 event happening this coming winter. Well, hopefully by then, you know, we'll be better prepared as an industry. We'll be better prepared in terms of medical treatments, vaccinations,
I think
testing,
it's an
tracing.
interesting question, isn't it? Because he asks if we think airline measures will effectively mitigate the effects of another peak. I don't see that as being really the remit of airlines. I think the responsibility is squarely on governments and countries to ensure that whatever measures they put in place, whether it's track and trace, whether it's testing, whether it's you know, pursuing a vaccine, that's what's going to
And I've read somewhere that the airlines have become the whipping boys of government strategy and policy. And I wouldn't completely disagree with that. I think, you know, they are at the mercy of what government policy is put in place, and as governments change their minds rapidly, the airlines have got to respond to that. And it's tough, very tough.
And arguably that's going to be even worse in the future, right? With as much as Ryanair are slapping a writ into the German government about the Lufthansa bailout, that's a picture that's going to be repeated many, many times over. And it's not just they become the whipping boys; it becomes they have the control in many cases.
Yeah, and I think we touched on this back in April about, you know, at the end of this, we will leave COVID-19 with a very bumpy, uneven playing field between airlines, where state aid and intervention and protectionism of some carriers has allowed them to both survive and perhaps even flourish, whilst those that did not see that just can't do anything.
I think that's only sustainable in the short term, though, isn't it? You know, I think 6 months on, or 12 months on from now, that it will be interesting to reflect back on that point, won't it?
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you both, John and Mark. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for this morning. If we haven't managed to answer your question during the webinar, we'll do our best to get back to you in the next couple of days. As I've said a couple of times, we will be sending a copy of the recording to everyone who's registered to attend today. And a final reminder that we are going to be sending out a survey after the webinar to just get some feedback really on your personal views about travel and how comfortable or otherwise you feel about the idea of traveling. So please do take a couple of minutes to complete that if you can. We'd really appreciate it. Thanks for all of the interesting questions we've received, and you can sign up to OAG's blog to receive regular updates. There's a dedicated COVID-19 page where some of the insights that we've shared today are updated regularly. So please take some time to do that. And of course, give us any feedback on what else you might want to see there. Okay, thanks everybody for joining today, and we'll end it there.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.